we're going to listen to Nigel Jaquiss, and hopefully I didn't mispronounce that too badly. I think most of us know him as the investigative journalist for Willamette Week, exposing sometimes unpleasant truths. And of course, the big one was involving Neil Goldsmith back in 2004, for which he got a Pulitzer Prize. And he's continued that work. But what I didn't realize is that he is a Dartmouth graduate, and he spent 11 years as a Wall Street and Singapore-based crude oil trader. He decided to make a career change, went to the Columbia School of Journalism, and has been here in Portland working with Willamette Week ever since. So Nigel, it's now back to you, and thank you for coming.
Ron, I don't see him on a screen, do you?
I don't see him on the screen either.
Jerry, it's an inconvenient truth.
And I don't see an email from him either. Phil, did you get anything from him?
No, I didn't.
No, the other Phil.
No, I haven't seen. I haven't gotten anything from him either. Did you send him the link?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Well, thanks. My apologies to everybody for being late. I had a miscommunication, and but I'm pleased to be with you. I wish we were all together in person. I'm sure I'm not the only one on this call who's really tired of Zooms. I miss the human interaction, and I miss the ability to sit with people over coffee or a beer and find out what's going on with them. So I'm Nigel Jaquiss. I'm a reporter at Willamette Week. I've been at the paper for 24 years, a long time, probably too long. I cover, I guess, politics, a little bit of business. I'm sort of opportunistic in that I cover whatever I think is most interesting at the time. I've been spending a lot of time on the governor's race in the past few months. I've been trying to spend time, and will be spending more time trying to follow up on some of the ballot measures that voters have approved over the past years, including the Metro Homeless Services measure, which I'm sure you all know is per capita the largest homeless services measure in the United States, and is providing all three counties an enormous amount of money to tackle probably the biggest problem that we all are dealing with now. And we're interested in trying to figure out if it's being spent effectively, and if it's being put to its highest and best use. I'm very interested in the Portland Clean Energy Fund for the same reasons. That was passed by voters in 2018 to try and create jobs for people of color, to try and make our energy system more efficient and less it is a pretty loosely defined large amount of discretionary money. And our experience at Willamette Week has been that the more discretion that public officials have over money, the more likely things are to happen that shouldn't happen. So I don't want to prejudge either of those. I'm also interested in sort of following the city's housing bond, which we all thought was a big bond when it passed $258 million. It's now dwarfed by the Metro housing bond. So I guess what I'm saying in a long-winded way is I'm trying to spend my time in places where voters have given large new pots of money. I haven't mentioned others that I'm interested in. Metro also has a parks bond that they haven't done very much with yet. The Parks Bureau, Portland City Bureau of Parks, passed a large measure, which they don't seem to be doing much money with. So I could probably talk for hours about all the new ways which we have, we as voters and citizens have stepped up to try and solve problems in the case of homelessness, or to fund vital services in the case of parks that, generally I think many of us would support, but also our job as a newspaper is to try and make sure that the people who spend the money are spending it wisely, and that they're accountable to the voters. So in 24 years at the paper, I can't remember a time when the watchdog function of the press was more necessary. If any of you picked up a copy of Willamette Week lately, you'll see that it's never been thinner, which means there's never been less advertising, both because of the pandemic and because of the industry, the change that has affected every media organization in the country. That change has been going on for more than 20 years, the movement away from print advertising or conventional TV advertising to internet advertising or social media advertising. So we've never been busier, and we've never had fewer resources to do what we do. I shouldn't say that completely. We have stolen a page from OPB at Willamette Week, and begun about a year ago asking readers directly to support us, to make contributions, and that's actually been helpful, been very, very helpful. And we have been able to hire new news reporters for the first time in a decade, and additional news reporters. We've replaced people as they've left, but we haven't gotten bigger. Lately, we've been able to get bigger, and I'm really excited about that, because there are so many stories in East Portland. There are so many stories in West Portland, in South Portland, in North Portland, that none of us are getting to, not because we don't care, not because they're not great stories, because we don't have the resources. If you look at the Oregonian, they had 400 people in their newsroom 20 years ago. They've got 100 people today, or fewer. When I say 100 people, I'm talking about reporters and editors. So I don't mean to complain or make excuses. We have people. We just don't have enough people, and it drives me crazy to see all the things that are not being covered. And it drives me crazy when I hear people say, "Oh, I canceled my subscription to the Oregonian because it's too left-wing, or it's too right-wing, or it doesn't cover what I care about." There are two real roles, at least two real roles for us in the media. One is to let people know what's going on in the community. That's kind of the classic newspaper of record, where they cover everything, regardless of whether it's controversial or represents conflict or not. I'm seeing from Amy that she can't hear me. Are other people hearing me? Tony, can you hear me? Yeah. So the functions of the paper, one is to just let us know, let us all know what's going on. There was a school board meeting Monday night, and the issues on the agenda were, we're not seeing that kind of routine daily coverage anymore. And the second thing is to hold people accountable. And I think there's still that going on. We're still doing some of that. The Oregonian does some, the Trib does some, OPB does some, but not nearly enough. Not nearly enough. I think the city is in crisis at the moment, and when a city is in crisis, it's because things are not being managed well. People aren't identifying problems and coming up with solutions to those problems, and the press's job in that case is to be holding people accountable, and to be trying to explain, for instance, how it could be that we're putting so much money into in the homeless services, or in the trash removal, or even into police. The police budget remains by far the largest part of the city's general fund. We have fewer officers than we had a year ago. We have fewer officers per capita than we had 20 or 30 years ago. Those are all true. The question is, are the officers that we have doing what we need them to be doing? Are they all on the street? Are there uniformed officers doing desk jobs that civilians could do? Are the uniformed officers spending 4 hours waiting to testify in court for 2 minutes? So I mean, there are limitless questions that we could and should be asking that would help the city and the county move in a more positive direction. So I sometimes look at, I sometimes look at my inbox in the morning, or I look at the conversations that I might have with any one of you and think that if I just covered everything that I would like to cover right now, I have enough stories in my inbox to last me for the next 5 years. So that's really exciting from a news gathering point of view. From the position of a father of 3 and a homeowner and a tax-paying citizen, things can feel a little bleak. Things can feel a little bleak. I was finishing this week's paper on Tuesday, just as we got word that Mayor Bud Clark had died, which kind of threw a monkey wrench in things. And at the same time, my wife texted me. She said, "I'm at 82nd and Division, and 14 police cars just went by chasing a black sedan. Do you know what's happening?" And I said, "It's just another day in paradise, dear." It's that unfortunately is the new norm. And it wasn't always. I wrote a story 3-4 years ago about the low murder rate in this city and how it was actually exceptionally difficult to get murdered in Portland relative to other cities of its size. And I think that's the norm. If you look at 30 years of statistics, that is generally where we have been. We're not there now. In fact, you all know that we're at a pace to shatter last year's record number of murders. And so the city is in unusual shape. And I know many of you have been around a lot longer than I have, so you've seen things that I haven't seen. But let me stop and take a breather, because I don't think anybody signed up for the Nigel Jaquiss monologue. So could I pause and see if anybody has a question that will stop me from just monologuing at you for half an hour? And you can either write it in the chat or just
Okay.
just blurt it out.
Ron, go ahead.
Why don't you talk a little bit about Betsy Johnson's candidacy? I don't remember the last time that there was a serious, for lack of a better term, third-party candidate. We've had, some people, but this feels different, and maybe kind of the side comment upon the information that was released in the last couple of days, the poll numbers for Dan Ryan and Joanne Hardesty.
Yep.
Maybe you could, talk about what that kind of means,
Well, so Betsy Johnson, who's served as a Democrat from Columbia County for 20 years, and for the last few years was the joint chairperson of the Ways and Means Committee, which writes the legislature's budget, has long been the person in the middle between Democrats and Republicans. Her background is, she comes from a wealthy timber family. She's run an aviation business, so she's got an interesting profile. She had long, I think, harbored ambitions to run statewide, and I think that I wrote it, and the Oregonian and Willamette Week both wrote about some issues she had maybe 10, 15 years ago, which really slowed her statewide ambitions. She was involved in some real estate transactions around the airport in St. Helens, which didn't reflect well on her. But she is a very intelligent, very savvy person who has looked at the field and said, the Republicans don't really have a strong candidate. And of course, we know that the voter registration in Oregon makes it very difficult for Republicans to get elected statewide. Ron, you alluded to the polling numbers around the city council candidates. We've seen this group, People for Portland, do polling around the unhappiness of voters. And I think that really started, it was pre-pandemic. It was 2018, probably 2019, that voters really began to turn And I think that I remember in the mayoral race between Ted Wheeler and Sarah Iannarone that some of the smarter political consultants in town were saying in the middle of that race, when Iannarone, who was running for Wheeler's left, looked like she was really getting traction, that the issues of homelessness and crime and litter were already setting in and were likely to keep Wheeler in place. And he got a little bit of money at the end that helped that as well. But what I think there's a crossover between the disaffection that the very low polling numbers that both Dan Ryan and Joanne Hardesty have. I mean, Ryan and Hardesty are pretty different people actually, but their numbers are both low. And I think that reflects a general disdain, if even a disgust for incumbents. I think that Betsy Johnson is tapping into that. I think she is looking, we did a story in November about Governor Brown having the lowest popularity ratings in the country of all 50 states. And there's a widespread belief that Tina Kotek, the House Speaker, who has been the most likely Democratic nominee, will inherit Governor Brown's unpopularity. In many ways, having covered both Brown and Kotek for a while, Kotek has, although she's been an extremely effective speaker in many ways, she's going to inherit Brown's lack of popularity, and she's more introverted than the governor. She's less of a public speaker. She's just less comfortable in public than the governor is. So I think Betsy Johnson recognized that if there was ever a time for a third party candidate, it's now. Oregon's only ever had one unaffiliated governor, Julius Meyer. There's never been a woman in this country, in the history of this country, elected as an unaffiliated governor. She's gotten a lot of money. I wrote a small story this morning noting that Phil Knight just jumped in. He gave her $250,000 today. Tim Boyle, the CEO of Columbia Sportswear, gave her another 100. So she's raised $4 million in a very short period of time. She'll need that because most people vote with their party at the end of the day. And 60% of Oregonians are registered either as Republicans or Democrats. So it's a long-winded answer to say that I see the same phenomenon makes it possible for her to run as makes it possible for virtually anybody to beat either Hardesty or Ryan if they run a campaign. At least right now, the voters are just angry. So I'm sorry, I saw a question in the chat. I didn't want to linger too long on that one.
Nigel, the question was, what's the difference in mission between Willamette Week and the Oregonian?
Great question. So Willamette Week was founded in the 1970s as one of the early alternative weeklies. So alternative to what? Well, alternative to daily papers. So the idea was that you'd come out once a week instead of every day, and that would give you a little bit more time to consider not just what happened, but why and how it happened. And what we found over time was that the niche available to Willamette Week was the alternative was to focus more on investigative reporting and to try and do stories that are counterintuitive or that are not just sort of the straightforward, obvious narrative. So I think we've all been taught by the editor of the paper, Mark Zussman, who's co-owned it since the early 1980s, that you always have to question the conventional narrative and to try and understand whether there may be another narrative or where there may be alternative explanations for what has happened. And I think the Oregonian is a relative to its competitors as a regional, a big regional daily. It's long been a very good paper. I know people, as they do with anything, any local institution, can be very critical of it. It's got some great reporters. It's always had a lot of money. It's owned by an extremely wealthy family, the Newhouse family, that has a vast trove of investments across the media world and in other industries. So, but they've always been. They are an institution. They're an institution, as is the Portland Art Museum or Portland Public Schools or Multnomah County. So, institutions protect other institutions, and Willamette Week's mission then has been to, I guess, to tilt that windmills to try and find places where the Oregonian doesn't go, won't go, or where the Oregonian may have a blind spot because it's an institution and we're not. So the idea is to try and be small. Well, we don't have any choice. We are small. So to say, okay, what could we do? How can we compensate for the fact that we have far fewer resources than they do? And so, we were able to do that, I think, from time to time. And while I spent the first 15 minutes telling you how hard it is to be a newspaper company in today's world, one of the things that's changed dramatically for the better is our ability to do things like this, but also my stories depend on public records, and getting public records 10, 20 years ago meant you had to drive down to Salem or walk down to City Hall or go to the courthouse to go to state agencies or federal agencies and look through big stacks of paper. Making documents stored electronically has just leveled the playing field in some ways. Any one of us now can, if you know what you're looking for, find, and I'm not talking about just going on Facebook and finding some, unsourced, not credible material. It's made it a lot easier for a small paper to compete. So it's, we've had that mission of trying to be essentially a thorn in their side for forever.
On the homeless front that you were talking about initially, do you get much into determining which efforts that they're funding, their competence? The basis for my question really has to do, I'm involved with that through a foundation that I'm a part of, on the board of, and in researching these various entities to help fund, there's a wide range of competence with their mission, with their leadership, and with their effectiveness. Some of them are better at writing grants than they are, getting people off the street. Do you get much into that side of it, or critiquing the recipients' effectiveness?
Great question. So I did a story maybe 2 months ago raising this issue because what has happened with this influx of the Metro Homeless Services Measure, that's going to bring about $100 million a year to Multnomah County alone. And so they had set up this very awkward governance structure where there was a board of community groups, nonprofits that advised the county and set up a plan for how the money would be spent. And it was brought to my attention by some of those board members that the large nonprofits that contract with Multnomah County to provide homeless services were on that board. So they were essentially shaping the policy, which shaped the spending, which looks like a conflict of interest in any normal realm. So I wrote that story and people said, what a jerk I was and how I didn't understand their business. So I said, fine, let me see the contracts. So I requested 3 years of contracts with 5 or 6 of the biggest providers. And I've written stories about, Multnomah County really acts as a multi-billion-dollar pass-through agency. They pass through state and federal funds to a variety of providers, many of them nonprofits. And over the years, I've written stories when nonprofits go bad or they're in financial trouble. And what I've seen in those instances is a lot of financial analysis by fiscal officers or accountants or auditors saying, this nonprofit has the following problems, which have resulted in poor performance or lousy outcomes. What I saw when I asked for contracts with the large providers of homeless services was an astonishing lack of analysis and rigor. And one of the questions that I asked the guy, Mark Jolin, who runs the Joint Office of Homeless Services, I said, okay, you're spending a lot of money. How many contracts have you ended due to non-performance or poor performance in the past 5 years? And he said 1, and it's a small contract. And so the answer to your question is yes, that is something I'm very interested in, because I think that we run into this issue all the time. Most of the people who are in homeless services are driven by the mission. They're good people who are doing very difficult work with a challenging population for not a lot of money. And so I think there's an impetus, there's sort of a default feeling, well, okay, that's a tough job and nobody else wants to do it, so we're not going to ask too many questions about performance. Well, what's changed is there's a ton of money. Not only the Metro Homeless Services money, the city and the county have each been putting about $35 million a year into the joint office. So now they're going to have $170 million this year of local money and a lot of federal money, federal bailout money, federal stimulus money. It's no longer the case that we can say, oh, they're doing God's work and they don't have enough resources. We have to shift our mindset and say, they're still doing God's work. They got a lot of resources, and we need to bring a different mindset to evaluating whether the services that people are providing are effective and whether they're moving the needle. And I've written a couple of other stories, you know, the data is lousy, and the Multnomah County Auditor caught the joint office essentially making up numbers in terms of how many people they had served. So I think what you'll see from us and other organizations in the next year is a focus on what are we getting? What are taxpayers getting? Because I voted for the homeless services measure because I can see the need in my neighborhood and every neighborhood, at least on the east side of the city, every neighborhood downtown and on the east side of the city and in North Portland. But we got to we got to make sure that they deliver.
Very good. Thank you.
Nigel, there's a question for you in the chat.
Okay, I'm reading that now.
It says, since on the topic of governance, any sense of what a change in our city governance structure would look like during a transition? What kind of stability could there be?
Well, I don't know if this question is directed at something that's very important that nobody's writing about, which is the ongoing city charter review. I think it may be directed at that. I think, you know, I was just yesterday spent a lot of my day talking with a couple of people about the, you know, what is the problem at City Hall, and I think that we're talking about the very ineffective efforts to cite safe camping sites or villages for homeless people, which nobody wants, but nobody wants them, but they seem to be better than what's happening now. And, you know, the issue that comes up over and over and over again is that, for instance, Dan Ryan is the housing commissioner, so he's the point man on these citing these safe villages. He said he would cite 6 last year. We of course don't have really any quite yet. He's also in charge of Bureau of Development Services, which permits. Then there's Joanne Hardesty, who's in charge of PBOT, which controls the street right of way. And there's just endless rounds of bickering and excuse making about, well, we'd cite it here, but we can't get a permit. Well, I mean, the city's trying to cite the villages, and the city issues permits. So how can it be that it just cannot, the left hand and the right hand can't communicate? So that's a long-winded way of saying that this charter review is going in the direction, I believe, of trying to put all city bureaus under common management. And that may look like a city manager. Some people are afraid of that because that puts a lot of power in one position. That I think we're going in the direction, certainly, of elections by district. So instead of electing our commissioners at large, and I think we'll have more of them. And I think that it's possible that we'll have a more powerful mayor. As you all know, the mayor now is really pretty much one of 5 equals and is often frustrated by his inability to get things through council because he always needs 3 votes and he's only 1 vote. So I don't know how the final proposal will look like, and you know, we've been derelict, as has the Oregonian, in trying to tell people, here's how it's going, here's how the charter review process, which has been going for more than a year, is actually progressing, and here's where we're going to end up. What will it look like in the transition? Well, I think there'll certainly be something on the ballot in November, and I think, of course, won't go into effect immediately. But I think, you know, what we see happen, for instance, the drug decriminalization measure that voters passed, Measure 110, that didn't go into effect on passage, but almost as soon as it was passed by the voters, the police began acting as if it were in effect immediately. So we'll see I'm guessing we'll see a change in the form of government, and I'm guessing that as soon as the voters approve that, we'll move pretty quickly to try and rationalize what is a largely irrational system at the moment, where people are constantly hamstrung by the fact that the bureaus don't cooperate with each other. If I were God for a day, that's the worst idea I've ever heard, by the way. What would the first and second actions you would take to get folks off the street? It's interesting because I think what the city is doing, they don't explicitly say this, but many of you are probably familiar with a case that is referred to as the Boise case, which essentially said that the Ninth Circuit, the federal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, said that you can't criminalize homelessness and you can't basically, move people along in many circumstances unless you have someplace to move them along to. So there is an effort afoot at City Hall to try and say, okay, we want to move people along humanely, but we need to have a credible argument that we've got someplace for them to go. That's part of the rationale for these safe camping sites, and that's part of the rationale for trying to move aggressively towards shelter, which the city would like to do and the county's not too crazy about. So if I were a God for a day, I would cut through the nonsense around the siting of these places, because I do think that there are just way too many people on the streets, that there aren't enough shelter beds at the moment, but there are large pieces of property around the city that are underused. The one that drives me crazy, frankly, and this, I hope this doesn't offend people, is the Expo Center, which Metro owns and is out, by Delta Park, and is surplus. Metro doesn't really want to own it. It's not in their mission. It's property. A lot of it is paved. There's a lot of water out. There's water for plumbing. There's flat pavement for parking. It's close enough to the city and the services to serve people. We should have a very large, safe camping spot there. And there are other publicly owned spots around the city, and neighbors always hate it, and nobody wants one of those in their backyard. But there's enough public space to create a number of, in essence, short-term camping spots. The problem, of course, people will raise is that they may become long-term camping spots, but what we have now is not working. So that's what I would do. Trying to get to the next question. I can't read Amy. Amy Eccles has a question. City governance comes up. It doesn't, no matter, yeah. Let me go to the next one. That's easy. You have rewrite controversial stories and says people aren't crazy about a story you wrote. Do I have concerns about personal security? I do in a funny way. I have written some stories about some really bad people who have made it clear to me in private emails or other communication that they really don't like me and that they really don't like the stories that I've written about them. So I do have those concerns, not very often, but I do have them. And the one of the interesting things about having your email and your address and your phone number be public is that people know how to find you. And there are a couple of people who've made it clear to me that they haven't threatened me physically. They don't need to, because I know that they have all sorts of capacity to do bad things to me. And what we all know is that people can do really bad things to you without ever touching you physically. One of the people who really doesn't like me is a hacker. And but mostly I don't write about violent crime all that often. I try and stay away from motorcycle gangs or Russian mobsters or other people who might physically hurt me. But yeah, sometimes I do have some concerns. For the most part, I don't. Yeah, I do want to come back. The issue of homelessness, which I know is a raging issue in every neighborhood, and East County may be bearing the brunt of it more than many parts of the city. I feel as if something has really shifted. I live in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, and I think that the classic Laurelhurst, inner East neighborhood, which people really pay attention to politically, because the people who live, say, from Selwood all the way across to Alberta and north of Alberta, have historically been what they call 4-4 voters. They vote in every election, no matter what, and they usually lean to the left. They're pretty progressive voters. And I think for many years, people in those neighborhoods didn't suffer the kind of crime or dislocation, or the lack of parks or sidewalks, or the lack of safe crossings that many neighborhoods in outer southeast and outer northeast have. And so they could kind of just go on about homelessness. And that's all. And I think that you guys probably are feeling like, hey, the people in Laurelhurst or Irvington or Selwood finally know what we deal with all the time. But I feel as if the kind of classic Portland liberal attitude toward crime, homelessness, graffiti, litter has really flipped. And I think it's reflected in the poll that somebody asked about, that the Portland Business Alliance released earlier this week. People are very angry with Joanne Hardesty, who's obviously on the left on the city council. They're very angry with Dan Ryan, who is much more of a moderate. And I think that that you have a rare alignment in the city, certainly rare in the 25 years that I've lived here, where, and of course, crime started going down around 1990 and went down pretty steadily for the last 30 years. Now it's bounced hard. Homelessness has always been with us. It's gotten much more visible and much more difficult to deal with. And so I feel the city has really changed. People's political attitudes have really changed. I wish that we were seeing more choices. I mean, Dan Ryan may or may not deserve to be reelected. He probably almost certainly will be, because he doesn't have a lot of opposition. Hardesty does have two credible opponents, so she's going to have to work very hard to keep her seat. But I'm disappointed in the lack of candidates in the Ryan race. So we, the county chair, which I think historically Multnomah County has sort of complained to reporters, hey, how come you guys don't care about us? You don't write about us, you don't call us, you never come to our meetings. Now everybody really cares about the county because they have all this homeless services money. And there are 4 credible candidates running for chair, which is highly unusual and very exciting.
Nigel, does the anger that you sense around us reflect the national one? I mean, the polls for the Democrats look pretty bleak in the midterm elections. Is it all sort of the same wave?
I think the dissatisfaction here is higher because I think and again, I don't want to generalize about outer East Side or even East Side, but I think that in many ways, Portland was really in a bubble for most of the past 20 years. The city, unlike many cities, we've had steady growth, at times explosive growth. So that means we've had a bigger tax base, more services. We've been a darling of the national media. People have written about all the positive aspects of the city. And I think we were lulled into a real sense of complacency. I think that we've been riding on the coattails of people who had some great ideas starting in the 1970s. And some of those ideas, whether it was converting the Mount Hood Freeway to light rail or being, innovative around transportation planning or recycling and solid waste planning or having, a lot of parks. We really rested on our laurels for a long time. And I think now that we're seeing that, hey, you can go from 30 murders to 90 murders, and you can go from feeling safe in your neighborhood to feeling unsafe very quickly. And you can, you can sort of see this night after night of people breaking windows with impunity and not suffering any consequences. And you can see the 200 police walk away, and it take 18 months to replace a single officer. So I think the negativity here, and maybe that's a reflection, that's part of the reason that Governor Brown's numbers are the lowest in the country, that the negativity here is really high, because it's almost as if we had these illusions about ourselves that, hey, the problems that other cities are having, we don't have. Well, we do, and we're not used to having them, and we're not used to the consequences of not paying attention or having a dysfunctional city government or having, I think if you had to say one thing about Portland and Multnomah County that I think attracted my wife and I to move here from the East Coast, sorry, we're not native Oregonians, it's the sense, it was our sense when we looked around the country and said, where would we really like to live, that government here was still capable of making positive changes in the kind of endemic corruption and hopelessness that you might see in a Rust Belt city, or Cleveland or Buffalo or in Indianapolis, not to generalize, you didn't see here. You had a sense that things could be and would be better here, and for a long time they were, and now they're not. And that's really, I think, affecting the mood of the population to a great degree, because I think we have this idea of Oregon exceptionalism or Portland exceptionalism runs pretty deep, and people think it is better here. It was better here, and now it's not, and that's really hard to accept. And when you are feeling concerned or worried or afraid or angry, you look to somebody who's in power to say, hey, things are dark today, but they're going to be brighter tomorrow, or here's my plan for making things better. And I don't think that we've gotten that kind of leadership from our governor or from our mayor or from our county chair. None of them has really, in my mind, presented a convincing plan for how they're going to make things better. So I think that feeds into, a sense of disappointment, which can also be anger.
Nigel, thank you. We're out of time, and thank you for getting back to us, and for the work you do to try to keep the community informed from a different perspective on what's going on. We appreciate your work, and we appreciate your being with us. Thank you a whole lot.
My pleasure. Could I just say one thing that I should have said at the outset? First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I didn't say that. I was scrambling because I thought I had missed it. So apologize for that. What I wanted to say is, Nigel Jaquiss, my email is my first initial, my last name @wweek.com. All of you know something that should be in Willamette Week. All of you know things that we should be writing about. We're always looking for great stories. We don't have enough reporters to go find them, so we depend on engaged citizens like you to tell us what we should be writing about. So I'd encourage you to reach out with a phone call or an email and say, hey, here's what I think you guys ought to be writing about. You know better than I do that the east part, the farther east you go, the less attention you get from City Hall, the less attention you get from the media. So help us do a better job. Thanks for hearing my appeal.
Thank you.
And thanks again for having me. Bye-bye.